to Tuesday Tips and Tricks at 2 from Be So Creative here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, one of your bestest little quilt shops in town. We are really glad to have you guys again. We're going to take a detour before we get into anything, which is funny because we're detouring before we started. But hey, check out my top. Isn't it cute? Don't you like it? What if we brought in a book called The Tunic Bible? And what if we spent some time talking about how to make clothes to wear out of quilt shop things? If that's a thing that you're interested in, I want to know about it, because then maybe we'll learn how to put pockets in a tunic where the pattern has no pockets. Okay. But what we're really about today is I want you guys to kind of be thinking about what if I was going to be doing the competition of our primary color quilt, and what if I figured out what the piecing was like, and what if I figured out what the cutting, how the cutting was going to be accurate, and now I'm starting to get it put together and I'm sewing really accurately because I'm remembering all of those things. It's time to start thinking about the quilting, because you can take a very, you can take a very basic piece situation and turn it into something pretty darn cool with some quilting. And when you're making choices like this, by the way, this one happens to be all done with ruler work. Ruler work is a thing that can be done on your regular home machine. But when you work on something that the piecework is so sedate, shall we call it, that it's not the piecework that really defines it, then the quilting becomes what helps it to stand out. But what about like these pieces behind me, when we've got piecework that's going on and we need to choose how we are going to actually complement our quilt piecing with our quilting itself? The first thing that we want to think about is negative space and positive space. Generally, the easiest way for me to think about positive space is it's where something's happening. So in this quilt, we have this color that's happening. This is the positive space. This big white canvas is the negative space. Over here, we've got this little green guy. And in this one, again, we've got an equal balance. Actually, let's back up and look at this one broader for just a second. This one has a pretty, oh my friends, we have a giant stick in the way. There we go. Okay. This one is a pretty balanced between positive and negative space, but I would still call the green elements the positive and the white elements negative. And just a note, it is not that the white is always the negative space, but it's very common for us to use it that way. We can also do other colors that create the negative space. It's basically the resting place. If we have a quilt like our really super, this one. Let's come here for a second. This one, we don't have a lot of positive and negative space. We just have an overall pattern. You could argue that those light spaces are the negative spaces, but when you pan back and look at it again, you see how those white spaces create the stars. So are they really the negative space? So this one's kind of a muddy, but otherwise we've got these sorts of situations where we have a very clear positive and a very clear negative. Let's look at this one over here. In these blocks, we've got our positive space where we start to blend into less positive and definitely negative space by the time we hit the border. Come on over here. We're going to take a quick look. Again, we've got positive space and negative space. Negative space in quilting is a really obvious place to take some time to do some really fun design work. So we've got these big scrollies that are happening here. We've got this really intricate piecework here. Can we see that again? There we go. So we've got some really intense design that's happening, but because the negative space is so open and so big there's room, breathing room for the quilt to hold both of those pattern sets. So how do you decide what kind of quilting, what intensity of quilting, and what density of quilting you want to work with in your quilt? Looking at this little one right here, we've got some really, really strong high contrast situations. We've got very bold, very graphic kinds of lines going on. We've got like really sharp, clear lines in this whole piece. And you'll notice that there's no quilting in this negative space, that what's happened here is all the quilting has been done in the ditch. We might choose ditch stitching when what we want the focus to remain on is actually the piecework itself. We want the piecework to be the focal point of what we're doing. Now, if we wanted to bring the piecework down a little bit, we wanted it to be a little less graphic, a little less sharp, maybe we would send some lines down along this way, echoing this piece. By putting texture in this space, we would be softening the differential between the two pieces. Or let's say we wanted these really sharp lines to soften and kind of curve. We could do that by creating curved lines in our stitch work. So what I want to do is I just want to take you through a stack of quilts that we have here in the shop, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in each one of them. When we are learning to quilt and we're doing it by machine, so hand quilting has a tendency to fall very much into this sort of density of line, or to be very, there's a different quality to it. And so we're not going to really go into the hand quilting today. We're going to spend a little bit more time focusing on the machine quilting options. Hand quilting is one of the things I love to do, and most of the quilts that I do by hand with a really long needle. I use a Soshko needle, and I create big stitches. So I use a heavy thread, I do big stitches, and I tend to do things that echo the lines that are already in the quilt, because that is my sweet spot. That's my meditation point, and that's where I can feel the stress melting. But if the thought of hand quilting your quilt makes your shoulders rise and your butt muscles tense, don't do it. Just to shake it off and move on to the next step. So what we've got here in this guy, let me bring it over here so you guys can see the quilting pattern well, is we have a quilt that's very busy. There's a lot of information flipping back and forth between those two blocks. And by having an overall quilting pattern, it actually helps to unify across the blocks. Our eye doesn't have to figure out each of those individual things separately, but after our eye has had a chance to sort out the information in the interchange of the fabrics themselves, it can then go into the details and find that adorable little pumpkin that's hiding back there in that overall design. So stay right here with me, and I'm going to grab this one. Okay. This one is done with our Kimberbell fabrics, and again you can see we've got an overall design going on. If we wanted to, so again, this is by having that line that runs through all of the blocks and evenly fails to discriminate between foreground and background, between negative space and positive space. It's a kind of leveling experience. So we're neither lifting the heart out nor pushing it back. We're treating the background and the attention ground equally across the top. This is probably the easiest way to approach a quilt because it's a pattern that can happen without stopping and starting. It's something that happens pretty readily with the bigger handy quilter. Izzy says, hey everyone, so everyone wave back. Good job, thank you. I feel like Blue's Clues. Okay, So here's one more that we've got, again, an overall pattern. And when you do the overall patterns, you can start to play with things like the sea, the nautical themes of the waves and the stars, etc., etc. But again, as you back up from this quilt, you're noticing that first, you see the piecework. Second, you see like these lines. Let's see, these lines that are coming off. Your eye is kind of drawn to them, and it takes a minute for you to sort out what is it that I'm seeing. And so if you want to increase the activity of a quilt, and you go ahead and do that overall design, then you know that those lines that are unrelated to these bold graphics, those curving lines will cause somebody's eye to stay with the quilt a little bit longer. You do need to be careful with that though, because you can build so many layers of line that the eye just gets confused. And when our eyes get confused, we have a tendency to check out. So if I can't understand what it is that the quilt is doing and saying within a few seconds, humans have a tendency to be like, I'm out. But if what you can do is a careful balance between the two things of these are the lines I want you to see first, and then you lead the attention into the next layer and the next layer, you actually can have quite a lot going on in a quilt without the eye being uninterested or too confused and ready to move on. So let's look at some styles of quilting. This one is a very modern quilt. We know that it's modern because these elements are really graphic, really... Let's back up just a second. Do you guys know what I mean when I say really graphic? Let's talk about that. When I say something is graphic, I mean that the lines are clear and sharp and highly expressive. When something is intricate, the lines are finer and more nuanced, and there's a lot more layering that needs to be sorted out. Modern quilts have a tendency to be very large, very clean, clear lines, that there is a thing to see rested in a wide open plane. So this is still a modern quilt because we have these elements that are in these wide fields. Again, a very modern quilt because of the wide fields. Whereas the more traditional quilting styles tend to be a little more intricate. There's a little bit more going on in the blocks, and as they connect with each other, that's where we tend to make the differentiation between what is a classic quilt and what's a more modern quilt. More modern quilts are also more likely to use these straight lines, which are easier on sewing machines. A straight line when hand stitching is a pain in the tuchus. It's not fun, mostly. But on the sewing machine, doing this run across, shoop, 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 like that is not only more conducive to the machine quilting, but it's also another one of those very bold graphic lines. So let's look at this one just a second. I want you to see the whole thing. If I wanted to soften the modern look of this, and I instead followed these lines, maybe I even brought them all the way across, and I just cross-hatched back and forth across them, I would get something that felt a lot more intricate, and the intricacy of the piecework would change the tone of this piece. Additionally, if I just did this and I ran straight lines this way, again, that would increase the intricacy of the piece. I'm gonna show you some pictures on that in a little bit. This guy, we have an overall pattern that's interrupted. So you can see in here that we've got the overall pattern going on. And then you can see in the flower itself, there's not quilting there. You need to be careful about this because you need to be making sure that your batting is being quilted through all the layers as often as it needs to be in order to be stable. The other thing that we're going to look at in this quilt is you see all of these straight lines, square, 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 square. In order to soften those squares, the overall quilt pattern is curve, 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 curve. Now, if those curves were really wide and spaced apart, it would not be as good a balance with the straight lines. So we've got our tightly spaced straight lines, and we've got our tightly spaced curves, so they balance each other well, and the overall effect is that this is very satisfying. We're going to do a quick little check over here. Nope, I'm going to bring it up. I forget. Sorry, throwing things. Woo! Okay, this one, we are going to look at the density in the background and how increasing the density in the background causes the foreground to literally lift. By pressing all of the batting between these layers against each other in dense quilting, it creates situations where what is not quilted puffs up, which is used in this case to get our dogs definitely up from the quilt background. And what could be little tiny stippling in this case became dog paws, which is just funny. It should make you laugh. But you notice that we've got our smaller, less concentrated quilting happening in our sashing, so that the negative space around the dog becomes very intense, and then there's a resting place as we look in the borders. And again, we open up with these borders. So what you're doing is you're balancing density across the pattern. Now, if the only place that was dense was around this one dog, we would struggle with it a little bit more, which is why it was important to get the density again out here in this border territory. Okay. But as you noticed, we left overall quilting and we began to respond to what was happening in the quilt itself as we did this one, which is one of the things that we're looking at here in this one. Are you able to see that? Or nope, I need to bring it over. Okay, so this reads almost, because it's repeated and repeated, let's back out again for just a second. Because we're doing the repetition across, do you see how there actually becomes two blocks in this quilt? There's the first block that is seen in the color, and then there's the second block that is created by the quilting repetition. And so we have this give and take where your eye pops here, and it moves around the quilt, that these angles are drawing you across as you visually check it all out. That is an excellent experience in the density of the quilt and in shaping each of the different quilting shapes to the style that we actually have within a quilt. So, how do you choose that? We're going to spend a little bit of time with this little guy and talk about how you choose what's going on there. So, this one was done, and you see that we have really a couple of really strong places. We've got the intense color palette. We've got these diagonal lines that your eye finds really, really quickly. We've got the negative space and the positive space. And we have the sense that there's probably motion going on in here. So this quilting, we encourage the motion. Around and around and around we go. By having this dynamic where the line rises and falls, we're encouraging that round and round motion. By keeping this area dense and curvy, we're continuing that sense of rotation. But what if you're starting to feel a little motion sick when you look at this quilt? What are some of the other options? How do you define the options for your quilt? That's what I want to show you on paper for just a minute. Okay. Let's start with our straight lines. Awesome. We can ignore everything that's going on, all of the motion. Hold on. Can you turn that off? All of the motion that's just going straight across. By doing this, we settle everything down. It's almost like we've put it behind a fence and we've told it, hold still, buddy. But maybe this feels too aggressive and it feels like these lines don't have anything to do with the quilt. I actually feel like it's in a prison rather than settling down. But I still want to do straight lines. Well, now I can borrow the lines from the quilt and I can make it raise all the way across. So now instead of having this super spinny feeling, I have the motion of things being dragged all the way across. Not your gig, still not loving it? Well, what if, let's go back here. Easiest quilting on the machine ever, straight lines, evenly spaced all the way across. Both of these are accessible for a beginner quilter, and depending on what you're going for, could work just fine. Now let's say you've finished your straight around and around and around, back and forth. Now you're ready to try around. We can work within these diagonal lines and just echo quilt around and around and around, and we create this squared spiral. This squared spiral breaks apart our little hexagon pinwheels. Do you see how your eye, let's back up just a titch so we can see most of that side. There we go. Do you see how your eye starts to find the squares instead of the hexagons? Well, what if we flip it back over and now we're doing the star effect. Now your eye finds this star shape in between, and then the secondary point is back behind here. So it just changes how you emphasize things. So how are you going to determine what your quilt wants? I just took a photograph of the quilt and I laid it out black and white and I started playing with it. What if I started building in situations where I played with the idea of this being a giant flower? And if I round off all of these corners, does it give me a different feel? Now I start having a sort of spirally, petally kind of situation. And if I put my petals over my boundary lines, does that give me a different effect than if I plant my petals very specifically in each wedge? Do I have a preference whether I like it blending together or working apart? If I want to create this space as a whole unit, like our quilter did in the original one, we can create a design that unifies that. Or we can separate that design out, creating a distinction and a difference. And then don't be afraid to just doodle. Find out what happens when you just mess with the lines on top of things. So if we pull this out of here and we bring things going on like this, what does that give us? And my recommendation is take some time, play with your quilt and a marker on a photocopy, and you are not going to wreck anything. And you'll get a pretty good idea of what pulls from your quilt the kind of feeling that you're hoping to get. Final tip is we want to talk just a little bit about thread. Okay, I pulled out all of these green variegated threads. I chose green because I don't want my threads we're pretending that this green is the primary background of my quilt. And I don't want my thread to stand up too far, but I don't want it to get completely lost either. I love the variegated threads because what color is grass? If you go outside and you look at grass, you should find a bazillion different greens, probably within 1 inch of your grass spot. Similarly, what color is the desert brown? A bazillion of them, unless it's sunset and then it's kind of purple, right? So picking a variegated thread for your quilting allows it to talk to all of the tonal variations that are happening in your fabric. Does that mean you always have to use a variegated thread? Absolutely not. Does it mean that you should feel sad if you only have one color? Nope, because that is cool too. But I did want to take another second with our variegated thread, and I want you to look at the different colors that are actually in there. When you look at them bundled, especially these guys right here, they feel like they are a giganticus party all smashed together, and maybe if you're a little introverted, you're going to want to take 2 steps back. But by the time you've spread it out all over a quilt, come over here with me, those guys don't seem quite so wild. But do you see the green in there as well as the yellow and some of that hot pink that's happening right over here? Come on with me, right over here. Okay, back up a little bit so we can see. Do you see it in there? Now, if I chose to use this thread on this piece here, what I would be doing is drawing elements of the color all the way around all of these pieces, and it would quiet the differentiation between each of these pieces. It would blend them all together, sort of like when you do a marble cake and you squish the frosting across. This is what this will do. By making this one the invisible thread that it was done in, none of that got stirred together, and it stayed very distinct and very graphic. So it depends on, do you want to stir it or do you want it to stay separate? And if I were to put this on the white, it would stand up a long way. Maybe that is exactly what I want because I'm feeling confident and excited about my quilting. And maybe I don't want anybody to see it ever. I'm going to match the color as well as I can because I am not yet ready for that. That's what your variegated thread can do for you. Last point. Let's say you have a very crisp, dark top and you have a very crisp, pale bottom. How do you choose what color of thread goes between? That one, you're just going to have to lay the thread out on the fabric and see how it goes. But keep in mind that if you have a high contrast between your upper and lower thread, you are going to see dots. As the bottom thread is pulled towards the center, when you're looking at it from the top going straight down, you are going to see that little bump of the thread from the bottom. When you flip that thing over and you look at it, you're going to see the bump of the thread underneath. If you don't like that, then don't use contrasting threads. If it makes you cry at night, skip it. Find something that's more moderate between. Maybe you go ahead and choose the light or the dark, so that the quilting shows up on the front or the back more than on the other side. And in that way, you can create interest between the two places. So my biggest recommendation is, if you are designing your quilting yourself, doodle, 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 doodle. If you are wanting to quiet it down, go with something that's kind of more overall, or something that's super clean line straight. If you want to pep it up and make the negative space richer, go for something that is more dense. Think about, if your quilting is super straight line, do you want it to stay? I mean, your piecing is super straight line, you want to stay straight line, or do you want to start curving it? Have fun, like above all, have fun with it. Because really, the worst thing that could happen is you could make a great thing to snuggle under that isn't everything you wanted, so you get to do another one. Who doesn't want to do another one? I want to do another one. Thanks for being with us, you guys. We'll see you next time.